Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our final Milling Matters lecture, bringing to a conclusion this short series held by SPAB Scotland and Perth and Kinross Heritage Trust. Now, we have a lovely crowd here today with over 50 tickets sold, so thank you all very much for joining us, and I hope that you can imagine yourself in a packed lecture theatre. Welcome all. I am delighted to introduce to you Luke Moloney, Chair of the Dumfries Historic Buildings Trust. The Trust was set up with the purpose of advancing heritage by preserving and restoring for public benefit buildings of particular beauty and of historic architectural or constructional interest, principally in and around Dumfries and Galloway. Luke is a conservation architect and chair, and I'm sure will tell us more about the work of the Trust. He will be joined for the questions and answers by Ava Milroy, who has lived in and loved Dumfries for over 26 years. She works for the local further education college and is involved as part of the Rosefield Mills working group. She walks near the mills daily and has seen the buildings deteriorate over time, so was very keen to become involved in helping to save them when the opportunity arose. And so, without further ado, I will switch off and hand over to Luke.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, just thank you again for it is a great honour to have been asked to talk to you all. I hope you won't regret it. I will try and do the best I can just to explain the project, and very much look forward to the milling weekend, which is very exciting. It's very strange to think that I'm talking to 50 people but can't see anything except my screen. So hello everyone, and thank you for joining. I'm just going to set the scene and talk a little bit about Dumfries Historic Buildings Trust and the context of Dumfries, and how we came to feel motivated to take on what is frankly a terrifying project, the Rosefield Mills. Just to set the scene geographically, this is the Solway Firth. You can see the blue at the bottom of the screen. Cumbria in England is sort of on the bottom right-hand corner, and Galloway on the left-hand part of the screen. And Dumfries has the red circle around it. Within, just zooming in on Dumfries, you can see the River Nith, which flows in a southerly direction towards the Solway Firth. So you can see it coming down there. And quite a large town of about 30,000 inhabitants. And Rosefield Mills is just off centre, where the red circle is on your screen now. So this is a photograph of the centre of Dumfries, taken in, I believe, the 1920s or 30s. You can see the High Street, sort of lovely sort of camber to it, the mid-steeple, Greyfriars Church at the top, and Shakespeare Street coming down from mid-right to bottom left, which was really the edge of the medieval borough and a sort of defensive ring around the town. Sadly, about 75% of those buildings have been lost. It's extraordinary. That sort of starts to explain, the importance of saving what's left. This is the old brig, or the Divagilla Bridge, which is a rebuilding in the 1500s of an earlier wooden bridge, but which was given by Lady Divagilla of Galloway, and just those wonderful buildings rising up on the Maxwellton side. I'm going to rifle through some slides really, really quickly, just to start with, to set the scene of Dumfries, where the Rosefield Mills were built in the 1880s. This is the River Nith, that's the old bridge, and this is looking downstream towards the Solway. With those wonderful buildings, almost Florentine, sort of in the way that they drop into the river. Sadly, all of those have been demolished, and there they are. They're looking upstream from the old bridge. Really sad, except for the one on the very far right, which still remains. And this is again a photograph of the river. The call, which you see sort of center of the screen on which the boys are standing, was really a weir to, to divert water to the town mill, which is off screen to the left. You can see some laundry pools, bottom right. But that call was an extraordinary feat of engineering, which related to the town mill and diverted water to it. This is on the old bridge again, looking west towards Galloway, Maxwellton, 1950s. All of those buildings have been demolished, except for the house in the centre on the Brig End. Again, you can see so much demolition in this very interesting and ancient town. Everything I'm going to rifle through now, the next few minutes, has gone, literally. We've lost it. It's demolished. This is 1960s demolition. This was a wonderful sort of confection mineral works. Several bottling plants and mineral works were in Dumfries, one of which remains, also built by the Rosefield Mills architect, the Crombies. Just going through these very quickly, these amazing houses and buildings. The bottom of the High Street in Dumfries, and that's it, sort of centre left. Again, all of these buildings have gone. Very sad. On the High Street in Dumfries, no longer with us. All of these buildings I'm showing you have been demolished in Dumfries. This amazing terrace of houses going down to the river from Maxwellton, the Tartan Raw, sadly taken down. The Catholic Pro-Cathedral, St Andrews. This is looking from Shakespeare Street towards a primary school with its campanile, and the cathedral behind with its spire. Both buildings have gone. All that remains are the two towers. You can see the cathedral, which was subject to a fire, but really with only roof damage, but which was then demolished to make way for a new church. But everything around it has been demolished. Glasgow Street, the King's Arms, and this is what happened, very sadly. The Goat Close, Glasgow Street, and this is on the river again with the Buccleuch Street Bridge, which was built in the 1790s, widened later in the 19th century. The Theatre Royal, which survives, amazingly, almost the only building on that street which survives, but everything around it has gone. And you can see on the left, Shakespeare Street, 1910, and in 1979, really there's nothing left apart from the theatre and the cathedral spire behind, which we looked at earlier. Conservation area. Everything I'm showing you is in a conservation area. This is St Mary Street, a fairly recent photograph, though it's been gone through a sort of filter to make it look old, but it's a very recent photograph, and this is what happened with demolition of really a whole street in something called a conservation area. A very beautiful sort of corner house on Queen Street and Brooms Road, which was demolished by the local authority. Very sad and very unnecessary. Just the no need to do this. It's not what should be happening, but it's happening too much. Buildings on the Friars Vennel, which you can see on the chimneys. There's a sort of thatch stains in brick, which sheltered a thatched roof, which we believe these were sort of 17th century or possibly sometime after 1590, within the conservation area. Very sad. All of this on the Friars Vennel. The local school board building, which again in the conservation area and has been sitting derelict for some years now, is on our radar. The Trust's smallest project was the Cabby's Kiosk by the station, listed building in a conservation area, and looking very sad. We went into a very complicated tripartite agreement with the railway companies to take it on, and over the Christmas holidays it was demolished just as the paperwork was being signed. So not a successful outcome there, sadly. This is the ranch on Craigs Road in Dumfries, property of the council. We offered to buy it for £1, but we weren't successful. The council decided to demolish it. It had a roof and chimneys which were taken down, and then the building was in this condition for some time. Just a very recent photograph taken literally, I think, yesterday. A building on on English Street in Dumfries, which is in the process now of being demolished, again in a conservation area. It's just very sad. This is the back of the same building, and this is on Shakespeare Street. Those two buildings, the houses on the left, really one of the few houses remaining on this street. And this is the street, of course, with those spires that I mentioned, but with lots of space around where buildings used to be, just now a very bleak sort of environment. Again, contrast between Shakespeare Street before and after demolitions. So this is the sort of thing that's being demolished in Dumfries. In fact, this is my own house on Queen Street, and that now looks like this. So it really is very simple to repair these buildings. It's just, takes the right sort of attitude and approach, I think, and saves a huge amount of money in the process. It's not just in Dumfries. I think this is probably a wider Scottish problem, but living in Dumfries, of course, one sees it, and it feels very close to home. But also in the wider sort of Dumfries area, we've lost some very interesting buildings. Consalic House, this is the wing by Isaac Ware, which was published in the 18th century. And this is it now today, just very, very sad. And the 16th century or possibly early 17th century house to the north of it, which has also suffered and is now very sort of ruinous. Another A-listed building just outside Dumfries, Walter Newell's Hannahfield, very interesting and beautiful interiors, early 19th century, which is now roofless. Another house just further down the river, again, a similar situation, and now ruinous gate lodge. And so when the Rosefield Mills was marketed through I think it was future auctions in 2017 and 2018. Mark Zagadlo, who is a local resident, came along and said, this is really a project that Dumfries Historic Buildings Trust should take on, and I'd like to help. And so Mark was a great sort of force of energy to start what became a campaign to save the Rosefield Mills. We talked to the owners, we went to the auctions, and there was nobody buying the buildings. We didn't have the money to purchase the building ourselves, but we then started a campaign to purchase the building. This drawing is an abstraction of the river frontage facing the River Nith, this colossal and very beautiful shed, essentially, but with a sort of frontage in the Venetian Gothic style by Alan Burgess Crombie, Dumfries architect. And this was our sort of poster building for the saving of the mills. It just spoke for itself, and there's a huge amount of affection and a love for this building in and around Dumfries, and that was a great help in raising some of the money to buy the building. Just to give you the setting and the context of the mills, this is a photograph taken in 1928. The town centre is sort of at the top of the screen. You're looking at the River Nith, which runs from top left down to bottom right, and the red tinted area is the Rosefield Mills. Quite a large 10-acre site. I mean, it is a large site. It's not immediately, the scale of it isn't easy to grasp, but that red area, really the red area and also the untinted area, this side of St. Michael's Bridge, is about 10 acres. To the right of it, downstream, was Traquair Mills, a very lovely building on the riverfront, earlier than the Rosefield Mills. I think that was built about 1840. It was demolished in the 1990s for a housing development. On the opposite side of the river, tinted in green, is the Nithsdale Mills, which again was demolished in the 1990s, 2000s. And bottom left, a yellow building, which was a knitwear factory. The little blue tinted building at the top of the screen was a set of weaving sheds, which is the building in which the company Charteris and Spence, who built the Rosefield Mills, started their enterprise. You can see how much they grew. This is from the Ordnance Survey. I think this is about 1890 or 1900, 1910 perhaps. The red tinted buildings are all part of the Rosefield Mills complex, and it was a complex of buildings built over a 10-year period, more or less, from 1886. Our riverfront building along the river here was built in 1886 to 1896, when it was more or less completed. The red tinted building that you currently see is the extent of that complex of buildings that Dumfries Historic Buildings Trust has taken on. In other words, we own that little T-shaped section of the site. So it's 50 yards long on the riverfront and pretty much 50, 60 yards deep on the T section. It's a huge, colossal structure, 2 stories on the riverfront and single story at the back. And yet it's just a small part of that wider 10-acre site, which I'll come back to later. So the mills were built over a period of years for a company called Charteris Spence, and Mr. Charteris and Mr. Spence both lived in Dumfries and joined forces to create this this enterprise. The factory, the company started before Rosefield Mills was built, but you can see at the top and the bottom of this blanket label, this new mill building was, something which they were very proud of, and was something which they used on all of their advertising. And this is, it says 1960. Forgive me, I'm not sure why that says 1960. But the mills closed in 1939. They went into voluntary liquidation, and ironically just before the war, because had they continued for even another year, they would most likely have taken on military army orders and contracts for the supply of fabrics for uniforms and so on. During the First World War, the company clothed half of the French army with that blue serge, and also a lot of the British army. That sort of khaki grey fabric was also made at Rosefield Mills. This is a close-up of one of those images, and you can see the sort of grand scheme of the factory complex. The building at the front right corner was never completed in that form. It was only a single story, but the double story block on the left-hand side of this cameo is the riverfront building, which we have taken on and are trying to grapple with. So you can just see it's a sort of small portion of that larger site. The sort of Tuscan-looking town hall at the back right was the office complex for the factory. It was all the administrative center, marketing, samples, clients visiting, and so that was the sort of headquarters, if you like, of the administrative part of the enterprise. You can see at the center there's this colossal chimney which was demolished, sadly, some 20 years ago or longer. There was a competition held, and the winner of the competition was, the prize was that they would press the button for this demolition. Very sad. But you can see there that it says smokeless. They were very proud that this was a clean, modern factory. It was steam driven, but the boilers were all gas fired. And so obviously coal involved in creating the gas, but not on the site of the factory itself. This is a magic lantern slide of the of part of the factory. I think this is the finishing room. All these wonderful machines, none of which survive in the buildings. And this is a typical scene of the interiors of the building. So open plan, cast iron columns and timber roof structures with a large amount of patent glazing, very bright, open plan spaces. This is a picture taken in 1967, looking upstream, Triquare Mills on the left and Rosefield Mills sort of center, and looking very recognizable. Triquare Mills on the left was demolished in the 1980s and 90s. Rosefield Mills is the only remaining large-scale 19th century factory building in Dumfries. The others, as you saw in the Woodland Survey Plan, have all been demolished. The bridges we're looking at here, so Dumfries High Street is on the other side of the river, and we talked about the Buccleuch Street Bridge and the Old Brig or the Divigilla Bridge, which is to the left of the screen upstream. These new factories in the 1840s and the 1880s were downstream of the town, across from the town's dock, and there was no real connection to them. The suspension bridge, which you can see at the center of the slide, was built in the 1890s to provide easier access to the factories from the town. And there are wonderful stories of something like 2,000 workers in Rosefield Mills and Triquare Mills. And the bells or the sirens sounded at the end of the working day. A lot of these people would cross that shaky bridge in clogs. So you can imagine the sort of sound clip you could have got there, just quite a sort of a roar of clogs across this metal bridge. The bridge closer is much later, built in, I think, 1928 on the amalgamation of the boroughs of Dumfries and Maxwellton, and is, of course, now immediately on the boundary of the Rosefield Mills site. This is looking downstream from what used to be the town's dock, now the dock park, looking at Triquare Mills on the left and Rosefield Mills centre right, that wonderful Venetian Gothic Victorian building, and looking especially Venetian with the flooding. Not sure of the date of this picture. It could be any time from the 1950s to the 1970s, but you can see the drying poles submerged. Really, all that's needed there is a fleet of gondolas, and that would complete the picture. This is a very recent photograph of the mills, 2018, when we were campaigning to save the building, which had been derelict for decades. And you can see here a lot of the windows broken, and a lot of the glazing on the roof broken also, a lot of the slates missing and so on. A lot of ivy growth on the front, and generally in very poor, neglected state. But surprisingly in very good structural condition, generally, some local failures, but generally in very good structural sound condition, which is just a testament to the, I suppose, the simplicity and robustness and quality of that building in the first place. In the very foreground, you can see the black strip is at the very bottom is the River Nith. This is, again, a fairly recent photograph taken in 2019 in winter. We had wonderful snowfall, and it's just a magical image of that. What is an iconic for Dumfries, an iconic building, really. It's very prominent and it's much loved. The architect of the building was Alan Burgess Crombie, and this is a cartouche from a pair of houses on Lovers Walk, and built for himself and his brother by themselves. And this was Alan Burgess Crombie's side, ABC, and it's just a lovely little detail. And many similar details can be seen on Rosefield Mills. The Crombies were there was sort of almost a dynasty of Dumfries architects called Crombie. Alexander Crombie is a gravestone is on the left, and you can see his son's gravestone on the right. Alan Burgess Crombie, who was the architect for Rosefield Mills. Interesting, the stylistic sort of change from classical to Gothic and of course Rosefield being a Gothic building. This is a typical bay of the mills. You can see the top left falling bricks as voussoirs. This was of some concern to us. But in terms of masonry deterioration, this is, you're looking at the worst of it. I'll come back to this part of the elevation has now been repaired, I'm pleased to say, and I'll come back to that process. This is the central bay of the mills, and you can see, of course, the tablet at the top with the lettering Rosefield Mills. At the very top, there's a cartouche with the date of 1886. Just looking at this for a minute, this is the center bay, and of course, it's this wonderful Venetian palazzo detailing. The columns are all slightly different. You've got these wonderful shells below the windows, and you've got cartouches at the center two bays, which have roses in the fields, again Rosefield, and lots of different rose motifs in the carved detail around the building. Just a very romantic, elevation, this, and particularly the central bay, which is really the focus of that long elevation. This is the cartouche at the top with the date, of course, wonderful egg and dart molding around it, and foliage almost improves it, I think, but of course it shouldn't be there. Again, the roses, various different forms of rose details, a wonderful carved detail, another rose, and another, and a sort of cannonball, I suppose. But again, this is along each of the bays, there's this typical detail. And wonderful carved detail on the capitals. Stone is in places quite soft, but given that it's wonderful that so much of this detail still is very crisp. We, with the help of the Architectural Heritage Fund and others, including the wonderful Costanza Trust and Dumfries and Galloway Council, raised funds to carry out a feasibility study for the restoration and reuse of the mills. And we carried out extensive public engagement with huge excitement, I have to say, across everyone in and around Dumfries and the region taking part. It was just so inspiring and motivating, talking about the potential uses of the site. And looking at ideas, and this really was a lot of fun. An exhibition was put together really to gather more ideas and comments and feedback. We held this in a shop in the town centre on the High Street at the Stove, and people were encouraged to add comments and ideas on post-it notes. This was all collated and brought together to put into a sort of an options appraisal, which was completed in 2019. Lots of animated discussions. It was all very good stuff, and we've got a huge amount of material from this exercise. And this, I think, says a lot for Dumfries, which has lost so much of its heritage. And I think this is a very strong feeling within the town, and it's encouraging that that's the case. This, I think, encapsulates the sort of vision in a very sort of emblematic way of the possibility of this riverfront site very close to the town centre. The potential, the opportunity for maximizing the potential of the riverfront location, and you can see along the front of the buildings, there's an existing well-used cycle and footpath linking the town to the Crichton and King and Quay and down to the Solway. It's a very well-used route. So the suggestion that we're all very keen on is that there should be a very enjoyable public space between the riverfront building and the water that would draw people to linger and stop and have a coffee or a spot of lunch, or there could just be this delightful public space between our building and the river. So that's something we're very keen to explore. And also we feel that this large derelict 10-acre site, much of it derelict, that the animation of this building, its restoration and sustainable reuse could act as a really positive catalyst effect for the wider site. And we see that being considered, the wider site being considered in a more strategic way, which just hasn't happened yet. It's this key 10-acre site in a town centre, but there's been no strategic thinking about how to harness to make that place, that wide site, the best that it can be in the long term. So we're very keen to encourage more strategic thinking for that wider site as a key urban site in Dumfries. What we have started with also is the clearing of the very mature trees in some case along the riverfront on our site, and we hope to use that timber on site, whether it's furniture making or part of the interiors or the building process. And we have recently, with the help of the Scottish Town Centre Fund, been granted £130,000, which has been spent on urgent repairs to the building. In bricks, the voussoirs that we saw earlier, and these 4 bays of the facade, which were the worst affected structurally, these 4 bays have now been repaired and repointed. There was some structural stitching on the parapet with steelwork, stainless steel and cramps. So this has all been now completed. Just very exciting to see this work take place and to secure the building in a very basic way for a future. DNS Little local stonemasons in Dumfries working on this, and we're just very keen to involve as much local tradesmen and increase local capacity for traditional skills in any way that we possibly can. So it was very gratifying to be able to involve local contractors. This is roofing repairs underway, but you can see all of the positive things happening in the foreground. This is a large workshop space, which we any moment now will be able to make available to rent for some light industrial or crafts purpose. So this has all been reslated, and the glazing has all been repaired and renewed. The lead work has all been renewed. But you can see at the top of the slide the sort of endless further range of roofs which still need to be repaired. It's a sobering thought. Again, this sort of initial phase of repair works to this workshop. This is a single-story workshop space immediately behind our waterfront building and a part of the T section you saw on the site plan. We've repaired this very conservatively. We've kept as much of the original fabric that we possibly could have done, and we've patched and repaired on a like-for-like basis. With a couple of the trusses were repaired with pieces scarfed in, and sarking boards have been scarfed in and repaired, and of course covered with a membrane to improve the durability of the weathering, and slated using the same slates. This is a view, again, looking at vegetation on the parapet, of course, towards the Dock Park and St Michael's Church in Dumfries. and this is a view from the riverfront building looking south. You can see that some trusses have collapsed, top left, but they are assembled with cast iron shoes, and it's a very simple structure which we feel confident now, having carried out these first repairs, that we can tackle moving forward. What this repair exercise, which has cost around £100,000, has demonstrated is that it's demonstrated the costs for, just multiplying the areas, and sometimes there's some more complexities, but it's given us a real good handle on the cost of the repairs at this point of all of the buildings. So we now have a very good idea of costs, which come to about £1.5 million to repair all of our building. It's not a huge amount of money. That doesn't include, of course, money on fitting out and on developing a program of activities and all of the sort of additional things which it would be a good idea to consider in tandem with this to make it a success. Again, you can see some slating here. And with the riverfront building, one of the challenges has been because of, you can see rainwater has been coming in for decades, having to use a lot of scaffolding to access the roof. So knocking through mushy floorboards on the first floor. The beams, the joists are fine, but the floorboards have suffered. And so we've had to erect a lot of internal scaffolding to access the patent glazing and the sarking boards, which have been repaired and renewed. And, roof and clearing the site of decades of fly tipping. This is a recent photograph just a couple of weeks ago with some volunteers from the Eco Warriors, a local Rotary Club, and other supporters helping us with clearing some of the debris on the site. I mentioned the wider site, so this is a blurry image, sorry for that, but just to give you a sense of the context. So our riverfront building is that sort of diagonal rectangle to the left of the left corner of that red site area. And you can see the wider Rosefield site, which we're very keen to explore strategically with the local authority, with the South of Scotland Enterprise Agency, and with others, to put together a sort of inspiring, very broad brush master plan, or opportunities plan, really, just to demonstrate the opportunities of the site, where there could be a very interesting urban renaissance of mix of uses, some housing, commercial. It could just be a very vibrant, to use that hackneyed word, quarter within Dumfries. It's just something which we think is a no-brainer, as it were, particularly to establish a context within which our restored building can relate. This is really a little sketch on the back of a fag packet sort of thing, but showing and explaining the opportunities on the site. So you can see number one is the Dumfries Historic Buildings Trust building, which we are grappling with. But there's the Halford site, for example, number 12, with a large car park, 13. Halford's has to be one of the most prominent and one of the most ugliest buildings in the town. And if one was thinking, on a 50-year strategy, that might be replaced with something more interesting, more useful, more complex in terms of uses. So there's this wider site, which we're very keen to promote the strategic thinking for it. That's where we're at. I think it's probably worth recapping the process so far. We made an offer on our building in 2017, and we were able to purchase it late in 2018. the feasibility study completed really in 2019, and the funding that enabled that, majority of that came from the Architectural Heritage Fund, to whom we're very grateful. They've been a great support. The Costanza Trust, which is a local Dumfries family charity, and Dumfries and Galloway Council. We spent a lot of time with the Scottish Land Fund, who gave us an encouraging sort of, who gave us some encouragement at the start. We spent a lot of time applying for funding to them, but that wasn't successful. They felt it was more building driven than community driven. So that was an interesting lesson, and we are keen to address that. Of course, it's essential that we involve the community. The feasibility study, I think, wasn't a huge success in that it proposed a project which had a price tag of about 15 million. We don't believe that's fundable. And given the recent repair costs, we now understand that the repair costs for all of our building is about 1.5 million plus VAT, dreaded VAT. We feel that there's a more modest and more conservation-led project there that we would like to pursue, and we are committed to making sense of this building in one way or another. So that, I think, is a good lesson to have learned, that the costs aren't, they're not prohibitive. We should be able to find that sort of amount of money to repair this building, with then added costs to make sense of it in a way that's very dynamic, inclusive, and sustainable. Following that, there's been a period of time where we've applied to various funders, including the Scottish Government, without success. But 2 years ago, we were successful in getting the town centre money, which has enabled these initial repairs. And they have just really been completed, or still being completed, but by and large completed at the end of last year. We're now at the point where we are submitting an application to various funders, including the Architectural Heritage Fund, and also to the Pilgrim Trust, who've given us some encouraging feedback. We're submitting a stage 2 application, was submitted in February to the Pilgrim Trust, and we're also going to various other local funds. But for a 2 or 3 year program of project development. In other words, pulling everything together, all of the stakeholders, the community engagement, the nuts and bolts of how this building is going to be reused, and attaching the funding to that delivery of that project. We believe that will take 2 or 3 years, being optimistic, before we can get to the point where all of the funding is in place and the project can then be on site with contractors mobilized and the project delivered. We would be grateful for any suggestions, tips, helpful advice, anyone who would like to give us £1.5 million to repair our building, for instance. Or really, just to be serious, we would love any advice, suggestions from anyone who has experience in this kind of project. We're a very young charity. This is a very ambitious project, and we're aware of that and quite daunted by it. I just, at this point, will show you something else we're involved in. It's at completely the opposite scale. It's a very modest and sweet building on English Street in Dumfries. I think this is possibly one of the oldest windows in the town. It's probably from about early 1700s, and there's a date of 1590 on this building. So this is a project which we're also in the process of putting a business plan together and feasibility. So just to demonstrate that we are working on other things too. But this is our huge, huge challenge. I'm just going to put the slide up as a sort of end slide. just to, because it's just such a magical drawing, and by Richard Coleman, who has put this together just to inspire. The specifics of it are not important, but what's important is just this wonderful celebration of this riverfront site, this very special building, and it being populated by lots of people and users. I'm really going to leave it there, Lucy, and happy to ask or to answer and perhaps ask any questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Luke. That is amazing. You've got such a big challenge on your hands.
We really have.
I'm just inviting Ava to join us for the questions and answers. Hopefully she will get a little invitation just now. Yeah, you've got, I hadn't realised quite how big the site was overall. I mean, I've seen the picture of your frontage before, but I didn't realise it had such depth, and I think that adds an additional challenge to the whole the whole scheme, doesn't it?
And that riverfront alone is 60 yards, of the tall building.
It's a big space to be dealing with.
It's a big space, and then it's 12 meters deep. That sort of double story.
Yeah. Good afternoon, Ava. Thank you very much for coming along.
Good afternoon. Yes, yeah, well done, Luke. That was very good, very comprehensive.
Now we have a little stack of questions waiting for you.
Okay.
I'm going to start off with one which I think is probably astonishing all of us, which is from Alex saying, how can councils go ahead and demolish despite buildings being within conservation areas? What protection is offered by this status? I mean, I was astonished at the things that Dumfries seem to think they can happily lose.
Well,
we
yes.
ask the same question. Yeah, Ava, I don't know if you have.
I have no answer to that. I just find that amazing. Also, and Luke, you'll be very much aware of that with some of the other conservation projects going on in the town centre at the moment around the mid-steeple. Some good work taking place there, but again, as part of that process, in particular talking about behind what we call the Baker Savin, very prominent building in the town centre on the high street. As part of the clearing, they demolished that. Oh, look, what's it called?
The buildings on the standard close. So two buildings,
that's the one,
very
yes.
early buildings with,
Yes.
And of course, afterwards, the archaeologists go in and realize that they're from the, 15th century remains and all the rest of it. Of course, it's a medieval town, it's a conservation area, and these buildings should be retained. Really, really wonderful ideas behind the Mid-Steeple Quarter project, and it's to be encouraged and supported, but to rip all of the old buildings out and replace them with something that looks like Cumbernauld is not the way of delivering that.
No.
It's just so anxious making.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, it's almost getting to. I can understand if a building goes to a state of disrepair where it becomes a danger to the people living there and walking past. But you would think that a council should intervene earlier to.
So in many cases, repairs are cheaper than demolition.
Yes.
And particularly if you have the wider picture of, if you repair it, it can be used. If you demolish it, you have to build a whole new building that can be used. So it's just such a.
I think this is a difficulty faced in many parts of the country, not just in Scotland. It's all over the UK. We have this issue of demolition being preferable, people not understanding the value of what they've got. It's incredibly sad.
Yes. Yes.
And I think it's very short-sighted because actually a lot of the time that character is what ultimately makes the place special and interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what people want to see, why they come to a place. So I'm sure we'll come back further to that with other questions. The next point that's given by, sorry, excuse me, we've got some deliveries happening in the house. The next point that somebody has raised is Kieran from Perth and Kinross Heritage Trust, who's very much involved with local heritage skills, saying very interesting and commendable that you have used local stonemasons for the repairs for the facade. And he wonders, is there a firm in Scotland who specialises in conservation brickwork? Or were your masons also brick experts?
I suppose most of their work relates to stonemasonry, and they do a lot of wonderful conservation work. Have been working for the last 10 years on Drumlanrig Castle, for example. I believe they were involved in work at Dumfries House. So the steps at the front of Dumfries House, they effectively rebuilt. And they also work on a lot of much more modest projects in and around Dumfries and Galloway. We're very lucky to have them. Bricks, I wouldn't say that's particularly their speciality, but it's all masonry. What was really interesting with the masonry repairs at Rosefield was the evidence that, in fact, lime mortar hadn't been used. It was all cement mortar on this building, which sort of makes sense. 1880s, 1890s, but it was a surprise.
And so, what mortar did you use for your repairs?
So the repairs, which should have been completed by September, were in fact on site in November. And we had a long discussion about what we should use. In fact, we used a cementitious mortar, which contained a lot of lime, but we used the cement because we didn't feel confident given the temperature conditions, and also given the evidence of there being all of the existing mortar having been essentially modern cement mortar, which was very carefully chased out. Because of the structural shifting, that had all become dislodged from the bricks anyway. So in some areas that was easy to remove, but not everywhere. And so a decision was taken to use a cementitious mortar. I say cementitious, it's a cement mortar, but we did add lime, so it's not therefore a lime mortar by any stretch of the imagination, and not at all. It's a cement mortar, but we tried to soften it a bit.
It's very interesting working with these turn of the century buildings, and that you have got this mix of materials. Some of it is the real traditional stuff, and some of it is experimental.
Yes.
With these wonderful new wonder materials, which we now know are perhaps not so wonderful in some cases. Were you in discussion with the Scottish Lime Centre at all about creation of a suitable mix?
No, we weren't. I think just when we inspected the mortar, it was very clearly it might as well have been a modern cement mortar. It really was that obvious. And I think that surprised all of us, because we were expecting to see something more, more earthy. But it wasn't. It was very disappointing, in fact. And we took the decision, given the time of the year, that section we would repoint, on a like-for-like basis. And I think we agonized a little bit over that, because some of that was relating to sandstone, which we would have liked to have seen lime being used for those joints, but we felt it was a small area of the building, and it would be an interesting sort of test piece, which would be putting the original mortar back effectively.
I have come across in my travels brick manufacturers and brick specialists and things, and I wonder whether you've got a lot of decorative bricks on the building as well. Are they damaged? Will you need to commission new pieces to be created?
There is some spoiling, but it's a very low percentage. And the bricks are interesting in that they're solid. Actually, there's a mix of bricks. Some bricks have little square holes in them, and some are solid. And they're not, of course, the standard size. They're a peculiar size of brick. We may need to have some bricks made. A slight positive is that on the riverfront, a lot of bricks seem to have been deposited and left as a sort of, perhaps as a conservation defense for the riverbank itself. But they seem to be the original bricks, and so we might also be able to quarry some material from that. But the brickwork in the masonry is surprisingly intact, and surprisingly, it needs to be repointed. There's a lot of repointing to do, but the bricks themselves, majority of them are in good condition.
Do you know if they were local? That's a further question that adds into this conversation. Where did they come from?
We haven't found the answer to that yet. It would be just so interesting to see a specification or drawings for this building. We haven't found anything. And
you didn't. They haven't got their. They haven't got their town of origin imprinted into the.
They haven't. They haven't. No, they're completely anonymous. These bricks. There are no helpful
That's a shame.
clues. Yeah. But if anyone knows, I mean, we'd be delighted to obviously to get to the bottom of this.
Yes.
This question.
Well, the brick specialists I know of are a company called Bulmer Brick and Tile, and they're based in Suffolk, I think.
Yes, yes.
Of course, there's a much more bricky part of the country, but they might have knowledge of that sort of thing too.
There are also some great people who collect bricks and have a lot of samples of Scottish bricks, particularly in one or two cases. So it would be good to involve them and see what their take on the bricks would be.
You mentioned flooding just then. A further question. Dumfries obviously suffers from flooding, and how has this been factored into the studies that you've done for the future uses of the building?
Where the mill actually sits, because it's quite elevated, on the drawing that Lucas got up there, you'll see that walkway between the building and the river. At a really, really high flood, that will flood. But the Rosefield Mills site itself, Luke, I mean, you tell me if I'm wrong, but certainly during my time I've lived in Dumfries, has never actually flooded. So the Mills itself sits well above the waterline.
So well positioned in the first instance.
Yes. In fact, if you look at the drawing there with the idea of having a bistro or coffee shop on the outside, I think it would make an amazing place to watch the flooding. Sit there while you have your cup of tea in the dry and watching things float by us past.
Wave at people being swept by. I mean, that's the only, and we can feel quite smug about that. That's the only thing we can feel smug about is the fact that the elevation to the ground floor of the building is probably between 4 and 5 meters above high tide. And this is a tidal stretch of water, by the way. So when there's a high tide and a flood, it's sort of compounded. But the mills are much higher than. There's no danger there. Where there is a danger is on the other side, on the other bank on the white sands, and that's every year that's flooded, and that is a huge problem. But
in fact, the dog park area. In fact, the dog park area opposite the mills, again with all the trees there on your right, that in a high tide that will flood. So again, it's quite a bit of a spectacle when you look at that. Yeah, in fact, one of the photos that Luke has there, we're probably looking for, that is that dog park area opposite.
So that exactly, yeah. And
so
you can see that's quite extreme, but the ground floor is probably 3-4 meters above that.
I think the last time we had an extreme was probably about 2 years ago.
So is there a basement that you have in the building, or
no?
Okay.
And probably for this reason, I think. But also the natural topography is that's a high bank.
Thank you for getting that photo up. That's really useful for everybody to see. Would you mind switching your screen sharing off so that we can all three be a little larger for our viewers?
Of course.
Perhaps we can talk a little bit about the ownership of the rest of the site. You've mentioned that some bit is Halford's. What support do you have from the council to tackle the whole of the former mill area? And I mean, who are the other owners?
Just to the council in 2019, we had a meeting on site with the economic development officer, and I think we were all very much on the same page, that we thought this is just looking at a model here of the site. there's just so much space which has been so neglected for so long, and it's just such a big space that there needs to be a coherent master plan, we believe, and I think the council believes this too. And we went to SOSEP, as it was, when they were starting out. This is the South of Scotland Economic Partnership, to say, hey, this is a really important site. It would be really good to have some help with this in terms of strategic thinking and some funding for a master plan. We've been asking them for 4 years and we haven't yet been successful, but with a bit of luck, one of them is listening to this and they'll say, oh God, we really need to put someone onto this. Because it would just be so good to have that sort of level of support to have as a, I mean, there could be this wonderful symposium looking at similar former industrial sites in town centres. I know that there will be a wealth of them. I mean, that there could be some really, really good case studies of how those sites, often dockyards, for example, become the most dynamic and exciting.
You just have to look at Liverpool and what they've done there, whatever was left.
There's some really good, exactly, and there's some really good examples in Sweden and Portsmouth, for example, the naval dockyards there, Venice, the Arsenale. Is some of those buildings are used really imaginatively.
My hometown of Hamburg, I mean, there are plenty there.
So there are lots of really good examples. It's really good to have a sort of a symposium of good examples to inspire perhaps a very broad brush, not prescriptive, but a broad brush kind of thing. Look, these are the opportunities. This is what could happen at Rosefield. And maybe to have a sort of, just sort of set the tone that, this should be conservation led. It's in the conservation area. The buildings can be repaired because we've demonstrated that, and we've also demonstrated the costs, which is much less than, we were told repair costs would be £5 million. Actually, it looks more like just over £1 million. So that's helpful.
Do you have?
It's to some people it'll just be a load of scrappy sheds, but actually there's an interesting story there, and I think that could be a really good driver for a future sort of animation of that wider site.
There's a connected question. You talk about getting the support of SOSUP, did you say they were called? But somebody else is wondering whether you've got really active support from local politicians, councillors, MPs, MSPs, and so on, or should we all be lobbying them? Or
yes, please.
I mean, we have a local election on Thursday, so all the councillors will change, or a lot of them will change. In fact, some of them have already decided that they're not going to stand. So, come next week, we'll have a completely different council. We have MPs and MSPs, and I'm not sure whether any of them have really shown their really open support to the building. We have now, following the cleanup of some initial cleanup of the Rosefield Mills last month, have support of some of the local papers. They have quite actively said, yes, please make sure that to keep us in the loop, and they, I think, will get their support, and they will be sympathetic to our story, which is always very helpful to have the media on your side. But I think with the new council coming on stream, I think it will be quite key for us to, depending on who then is being voted in, to lobby them. I know there are certainly a couple of council individuals who are standing for council who have, as part of their election manifesto pledge, especially mentioned the Rosefield Mills in their manifesto. So I think that if they are successful in being voted in, I think we should knock at their door pretty quickly and say, okay, now you're taking place, come and do stuff for us.
That's a positive start at any rate, isn't it?
It's encouraging.
But if anybody feels like writing to the MPs and MSPs and local councillors of the area, it's not going to go amiss.
No.
Now, as a connected, slightly political question here, further to the initial question about conservation areas and demolition of buildings within those, is there a great deal of public outcry? Presumably this ought to carry some weight as the council plans to demolish or otherwise spoil buildings, you know, the actual feeling of the public. Do the public uprise against these demolitions? Are they reported negatively within the local press?
I think people are disappointed and probably, but also at the stage of thinking, oh well, it's the council. That buildings like the one that is literally just probably going to be demolished in English Street, that it actually gets to the stage for them to become a danger and probably need to be demolished because things are falling down and adjacent buildings are also being affected. But it's this sort of lack of, or apparent lack of urgency in stepping in and talking to trying to find absent landlords and doing something about it. It's this sort of, oh well, we haven't got time and we haven't got people or whatever, but it's just, and then it gets too late, and then the only thing apparently is available is just pull it down and it's gone.
I think it's interesting the focused summary that you gave us at the start of this lecture, Luke. I think that really puts it into sharp perspective how many buildings are demolished and within what period of time. And I think perhaps if there were to be an exhibition of Dumfries's lost buildings or something of that, something like that, you know, it might make people think, oh, actually, gosh, we lost 3 this year, or whatever, whatever the number is. It might sort of make them think, hang on a minute, this isn't quite right here. we need to do something.
I think people are very, I mean, as you mentioned earlier, it's the old buildings, they give the character of a town, and otherwise you end up with monochrome high streets with your Boots and Marks and Spencers. Nothing against Boots and Marks and Spencers, but whether you go to Nottingham, Dumfries, Glasgow, Leeds, the high street has the same shops, the types of houses of building, so why should it go from one town rather than the other town? So the architecture builds the character and sets the scene for the town. And yes, I think people probably need to be put into their face that, look, this would have looked like 10 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. So not that we want to live in the medieval ages and say, well, we all have to live in half-timbered houses and whatever else. And changes to buildings also are part of your history. But I think being sensitive and sensible in the way you combine old and new, again, thinking about some being German, and some of the town that my brother lives in is a similar, probably slightly larger than Dumfries. But when I picture their town centre and a pedestrianised town centre, even the modern buildings, when they have been built in such a style that they really blend in with the older buildings to have a nice coherent townscape, rather than this sort of 1960s equivalent block of concrete or whatever else just being thrown in. And I think it's having that sort of vision of, think of what you want to achieve here and to make it a special place. And I don't think that, for me, the thought is not there.
I think there's another take on this, and that is the whole green side of things. We had COP26 in Glasgow last year, and suddenly everybody was thinking about reuse of buildings, adaptive reuse, retrofit, how to restyle what they already have. And, playing devil's advocate, do you really want to knock Halfords down, or do you actually want to reframe it as something else using parts of the existing structure? it's easy to imagine that for some more modern buildings, but I think people get unstuck when they try to do it with old buildings. The rooms are the wrong size. They're not allowed to keep this wall. The staircase isn't big enough, or whatever the problem is. But actually, really, you've got a huge amount of embodied energy sitting there that really we should be doing our best to keep if we possibly can. So there are many other arguments, as well as the historic buildings and conservation historical side of things. May I move on to the intended use of the site? And there's a few questions which cover this. Have you got specific intentions for the community or commercial uses in parts of the site? Or will you carry out further community consultations, or simply await opportunities through the development phase? How are you?
I think it's probably a combination of all of those. We just received and assimilated and assessed so many amazing ideas from the initial Planning Aid Scotland carried out a really comprehensive consultation exercise for us, and it was just so overwhelming, really, the amount of really good ideas and the amount of things that people in Dumfries want and need. And not all of those are necessarily providing a coherent mix, but if this building can deliver a small amount of those, I think that's a success.
Can you give us a few examples? What
so, for example,
your most memorable point?
What was interesting, that housing was a very emotive thing.
Yes.
A lot of people said they didn't want this to be housing. This had to be a public building. This is a communal space. It's not housing, and especially not private housing. So, of course, that if you were a business person, that would be the easy, you know exactly how much money that's bringing in, and it's just an easy business plan. We've looked at several options, one of which was an arts centre. So you can see there being very the building lending itself very well to a large art gallery. Think of the Bankside Tate in this factory building. It would just be sensational. But would that work all of the time? Perhaps it might need to be connected with a sort of a conference centre. I just think of the Arsenale buildings in Venice, which are so flexible and are used so widely for all sorts of things, from smart sort of dinners to exhibitions and trade shows and expositions of sort of huge scales. You've got that scale in Rosefield. It's the only building in the town, in fact in the region, with those sort of spaces, and so you have to think of that kind of unique, the USP, as it were, in terms of just its physical attributes, but also then you've got the riverside setting, and I think there's just a sort of everyone says, there should be a really good food and drink and catering offering where people can enjoy that space on the riverfront. So that seems to be an obvious sort of anchor. If you've got
and that was also one of the other ones was, if I remember correctly, to use, and again I suppose did almost the current opportunity to use one of the workshop spaces. Again, if I remember correctly, I think there was a suggestions of having some larger workshop space also for artists and so on, rather than your little studio somewhere in a backyard somewhere, but actually having where somebody, if somebody wants to do in some environmental arts piece or whatever else, then actually needing something to drive a lorry in and out of or whatever, so you're having a bigger space that they could rent out, or even on a part-time basis. So I need it during July and August to do something for the winter. So that sort of idea as well.
And also ideas like tool libraries, and there's some really good there are some really good examples of where industrial spaces are used for communal workshops and and also teaching skills and teaching and just bringing people together to sort of work on projects. Another strong theme was food, and with Altrincham Market, for example, being cited as a really good case study. Also the Time Out Market in Lisbon, which is this great sort of food market, the space like Rosefield Mills, but then with lots of independent, sort of caterers and artisanal producers, and that you can sort of go shopping and then have lots of chairs and tables and sit down with your picnic sort of thing.
I
So
suppose
there was a lot of that sort of suggestion. And then the other thing was an archive centre. Dumfries and Galloway should have an archive centre, but doesn't. And so that was something which was suggested. But I think the problem with, and there are lots of others. There's a bowling alley, for example, multi-screen cinema, climbing a wall, and a swimming pool at one point. I mean, that would just be the most magical swimming pool enclosed in that space. But I think the interesting thing that we started this in 2018, it's now 4 years later, is that those list of things that Dumfries needs changes. So, for example, with the Lawburn Hall, this large affordable space is now provided in the Lawburn Hall. Hopefully that will continue. Other things like the food market, there's now a food market at the railway station in the covered platforms. And also there's a great sort of initiative of artisanal producers in the high street, in the traditional market. The idea of lots of these ideas change because, or rather become these things that are needed become provided by other people. So, of course, it's about being complementary rather than competing with things too.
I think it will be interesting also to see how you feel your population radius will be able to support these things. Some of the examples you've given, Lisbon, Venice, they've got very much larger populations than Dumfries, or indeed the hinterland of Dumfries. And whilst these are wonderful ideas, are they actually financially sustainable becomes a big question. Or can you create something that is so wonderful that you become a Bilbao, you become a destination? But that's incredibly hard to achieve, isn't it? So lots of people saying what an exciting and extraordinary project this is. And we wondered, whether there are any other precedents that you've been looking at to help explain to community members and funders what you're aiming for. Somebody's suggesting that you connect with something called the Stove, which I haven't come across before. And looking at Moat Bray, which I think is that's in Dumfries as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
Are there connections being made with these other organisations too? Can you become on a route of interesting places to visit?
Yes, there certainly are connections with the Stove and Moat Bray and Mid-Steeple Quarter. They're all, yes, as I said, they're all within the same, all doing similar things, but on a slightly different theme. So yes, we're all linked in some way or another. But I think it's looking beyond Dumfries to see what examples there are, what people have done successfully, and looking for examples in probably towns of similar size, so that can see.
When you were showing the roofing repair photographs, Luke, it very much reminded me of a project I was involved with in Loughborough, Taylor's Bell Foundry. I don't know if you've come across it before. Grade 2 star listed, again, similar era, late Victorian, but it has the same problem of large expanses of roof to deal with. But they, of course, have got a lot of their industry still existing inside. They've got the destination of being a foundry, and I think that's the thing that you're lacking, really, isn't it? You haven't got any of your original machinery. You've got a few little things in archives here and there, but the original raison d'etre of the building has vanished, and that's what makes it so challenging to find a new use.
Yes, and also one would want an inspiring use. The use for the last sort of 50 years at least has been related to the car industry, panel beaters, body shops, car cleaning. And I think these days that can much more easily happen in other places that didn't previously exist. The Heath Hall, other sort of more industrial areas. This seems a shame that it should be industrial in the center of the town. That's not to say that there couldn't be a mix, but for it to be all just sort of, oily workshops seems a missed opportunity.
And now this One further question in the same vein. The lady writing it says she hopes it's not a silly question. I don't think it's a silly question at all. But have you been to visit the other mills, other large mill industrial complexes in Scotland? New Lanark, Stanley, Paisley. They've all been successfully restored and to some extent pay for themselves. Have you been to visit them and discussed how they achieved that?
I think we need to do a lot more of that. And it's just the time and the resources too, of course. But we have been very keenly looking at other examples, and particularly, in the Midlands of England, for example. But also the examples that Nora types there. It's just, I think, yes, I think, as part of the project development at the early stage, we need to probably have a really a focused and comprehensive sort of a study of this. Yeah, it's a very good point.
I think you should add Saltaire Mill near Bradford into your list as well.
Yes,
because that's a wonderful example of a great, huge building that has been turned into a wonderful complex of all sorts of things. It's got a kitchen shop, it's got an art centre, it's got exhibition space. There's lots happening there.
Yes.
And it's it has used its decorative image externally, I think, to great benefit as well. And I think you've got you've got such a lovely decorative exterior as well that can sort of inspire people to be interested in the building too.
We've submitted an application to the Pilgrim Trust, and also in progress, once the feasibility work's completed, will be an application to the Architectural Heritage Fund. And we've also applied to SOCI, South of Scotland Economic Agency, for funding for a project development officer. And so we hope within the next few months to be advertising for that full-time post. And we will have someone dedicated to, actually it would be really good to have a copy of all of these questions, because they're all just so good. For them to sort of work through, well, for all of us to work through, but that we'll have someone who will be really focused in a meaningful way on developing this project and pulling together all of these wonderful ideas and strands, into one sort of focused vision.
I can certainly make a copy of the questions for you.
Oh, that would be great, Lucy.
There's one little element of one of them which just caught my eye, which I think I had missed off, and that is, are you looking at ways of incorporating sustainable ways of providing energy? You've got the river right next to you, you've got a huge expanse of roof. How do you think you might approach sustainability?
We're very keen to do this, and I think the river could be an opportunity in terms of, even with the sort of aquatic version of ground source heating. So yes, and this is something that I think we're all very keen to pursue.
Yeah, and again, as I said, the roof space would, again, in keeping with the architectural heritage of the building, but if there was a way of incorporating solar panels and whatever else to make the most of that huge space, yes, it's really not to.
Now we're drawing to a close. I've got one final question sitting here in front of me, and it goes back to the statutory process of demolitions within the conservation area, and the suggestion that should applications really be vetted by someone other than the local council, who are seemingly driving the changes in some cases.
I'm just gobsmacked by the Mid-Steeple Quarter development, which has a council endorsed master plan for effectively the demolition, just ripping the guts out of a whole urban block in the conservation area and replacing it with blocks of flats. It's not clever. It's just not clever. But what's interesting with that is that when that first phase of that work on the standard close was submitted to planning, it involved the demolition of two buildings specifically, one of which was a very early house, and clearly an early house, and with the roof pitch had originally been thatched and so on. A lot of the detail had been lost, but it was something which was restorable and frankly useful. And also then there was an old inn which was roofless, but was roofless in the 1850s, but all of the masonry, or 3 of the masonry walls were still there. So again, that's something which could have been added to and retained, and would have told a much more interesting story than, this tabula rasa where you've just demolished absolutely everything. In fact, ironically, what they've kept is the modern building on the street frontage, and they've demolished all of the interesting historic buildings along the close.
Yeah.
Now, this is in accordance with the council's own master plan, but it's also in a conservation area. So how do you reconcile that? And the other thing is, which is confusing me, and I'd love it if there was an answer, is that the Architectural Heritage Society wrote in support of this demolition exercise and redevelopment. And also, it's just, you just sort of think, well, so who is the other body? Because they would be the body that you would think, well, they could also look at these, and they do, of course. Their cases panel do some wonderful work. But if their cases panel is saying, yeah, we're really in support of all of this demolition of really old buildings in a conservation area, I don't know what the answer is.
Well, SPAB Scotland also has a very small casework team. You're welcome to send us alerts for anything which you think is being demolished anywhere in the country. We'll happily take a look at it. We can't promise to write every time because it is me and a volunteer in our spare time.
Please may I send you details of the furniture, of the treasure cave.
I mean, the difficulty with amenity societies and this sort of demolition within simply a conservation area is usually that we are only ever informed of buildings which are listed. And so if the building is not listed, then we don't usually have the information to hand that this is going to happen. And so it's difficult to find these instances unless local people write to us to inform us about what's going on.
That's interesting, though. Yeah.
But do keep SPAB Scotland in mind. We'd be delighted to hear from anybody in the country, wherever you are, about anything that you think is going amiss with your local heritage. Please let us know. We'd be only too happy to try and help. Now, we have in fact come to the end of our time. Luke and Eva, thank you so much for coming today and giving us the talk and information. And thank you to everybody who has turned up to listen to the last of our Milling Matters lectures. I hope you've all enjoyed it as much as I have. Hopefully we have all been inspired to create a small influx of visitors to Dumfries for you, and we'll keep a lookout for all these interesting buildings you've pointed out. We send you all a virtual round of applause. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And finally, once again, I'd like to mention our Milling Matters Scottish Mills weekend coming up at Lower City Mills in Perth. It really will be an amazing weekend with many networking opportunities and chances to discuss the future of milling in Scotland, mill buildings, how they should be repaired, looked after, maintained, all the rest of it. This will all be hosted in conjunction with our partners, Perth and Kinross Heritage Trust. So if you'd like to come along, tickets are available. Thank you once again to all our guests and hosts, and goodbye.